Start working, please. Thank you. The fit and the unfit. If there was one achievement through which the Weimar Republic could claim the loyalty and gratitude of the masses, it was the creation of a new welfare state. Of course, Germany did not lack welfare institutions before 1914, particularly since Bismarck had pioneered such things as health insurance, accident insurance, and old age pensions in an attempt to wean the working classes away from social democracy. Bismarck's schemes, which were elaborated and extended, Bismarck's schemes, which were elaborated and extended in the years following his departure from office, were pioneering in their day and cannot be dismissed simply as fig leaves for governmental authoritarianism. Some of them, notably the health insurance system, covered millions of workers by 1914 and incorporated a substantial element of self-governance that gave many workers the chance of electoral participation. Yet none of these schemes reached anywhere near the bottom of the social scale, where police administered poor relief, bringing with it the deprivation of civil rights, including the right to vote, was the norm right to the end of the Wilhelmine period. Still, even here, the operation of the system had been reformed and standardized by 1914, and the new profession of social work that had emerged on the back of the Bismarckian reforms was busy assessing and regulating the poor, the unemployed, and the destitute, as well as the ordinary worker. On the basis of this modern version of Prussian bureaucratic paternalism, however, the Weimar Republic erected a far more elaborate and comprehensive structure, combining, not without tension, the twin influences of social Catholicism and Protestant philanthropy on the one hand, and social democratic egalitarianism on the other. The Weimar Constitution itself was full of far-reaching declarations of principle about the importance of family life and the need for the state to support it, the government's duty to protect young people from harm, the citizens' right to work, and the nation's obligation to provide everybody with a decent home. On the basis of such principles, a whole raft of legislation was steered through the Reichstag, from laws dealing with youth welfare and juvenile courts to regulations providing relief and job training for the war disabled, decrees replacing poor relief with public welfare, and above all, as we have seen, the statutory provision of unemployment benefits in 1927. Existing schemes of health insurance, pensions, and the like were further elaborated and extended to all. Massive housing schemes, many of them socially innovative, were initiated with over 300,000 new or renovated homes being provided between 1927 and 1930 alone. The number of hospital beds increased by 50% from the pre-war days, and the medical profession also expanded accordingly to keep pace. Infectious diseases declined sharply, and a network of clinics and social welfare institutions now supported socially vulnerable individuals, from single mothers to youths who got in trouble with the police. The creation of a free and comprehensive welfare system as the entitlement of all its citizens was one of the major achievements of the Weimar Republic. Perhaps in retrospect, it's most important. But for all its elaboration, it failed in the end to live up to the grandiose promises made in the 1919 Constitution, and the gap between promise and delivery ended by having a major effect on the legitimacy of the Republic in the eyes of many of its citizens. First, the economic difficulties that the Republic experienced almost from the outset placed a burden on its welfare system that it was simply unable to sustain. There were very large numbers of people who required support as a result of the war. Some 13 million German men served in the armed forces between 1914 and 1918. Over 2 million of them were killed. According to one estimate, this was the equivalent of one death for every 35 inhabitants of the Reich. This was nearly twice the proportion of war deaths in the United Kingdom, where one soldier died for every 66 inhabitants, and almost 3 times that of Russia, where there was one war death for every 3 inhabitants. Wait, what? Where there was one war death for every 100 inhabitants. Is that what that's supposed to mean? Is this some weird British way of writing numbers? I know there's some awake bonger in here. And almost 3 times that of Russia. I'm going to assume it's 1 for every 100 because that would make sense. It's almost 3 times, I guess, huh? Oh, no, 111. That's what that means. Why are the ones written as I's? For 111 inhabitants. Okay. By the end of the war, over 500,000 German women were left as war widows, and 1 million German children were without fathers. About 2.7 million men came back from the war with wounds, amputations, and disabilities to form a permanent source of discontent as the politicians promised rewards for their service to the nation failed to materialize to anyone's satisfaction. The government increased taxes on the better off to try and cope until the real tax burden virtually doubled as a percentage of real national income from 9% in 1913 to 17% in 1925, according to one admittedly biased estimate. Yet, this was in no way enough to cover expenditure, and governments dared not go any further for fear of being accused of raising tax revenues to pay reparations and alienating even further those who paid the most taxes. Not only did the economy have to bear the burden of unemployment insurance after 1927? It was in 1926 still paying pensions to nearly 800,000 disabled former soldiers and 360,000 war widows, and supporting over 900,000 fatherless children and orphans, and all this on top of an existing system of state support for the elderly. The payment of pensions took up a higher proportion of state expenditure than anything apart from reparations. Finally, the welfare system boosted an already swollen bureaucracy in the Reich and the Federated States, which increased in size by 40% between 1914 and 1923, almost doubling the cost of public administration per head of the German population in the process. Such massive expenditure might have been feasible in a booming economy, but in the crisis-racked economic situation of the Weimar Republic, it was simply not possible without printing money and fueling inflation, as happened between 1919 and 1923. Or, from 1924, by cutting back on payments, reducing the staffing levels of state welfare institutions, and imposing ever more stringent means testing on claimants. Many claimants thus quickly realized that the welfare system was not paying them as much as they needed. Local administrators were particularly stingy, since local authorities bore a sizable proportion of the financial burden of welfare payments. They frequently demanded that claimants should hand over their savings or their property as a condition of receiving support. Welfare snoopers reported on hidden sources of income and encouraged neighbors to send in denunciations of those who refused to reveal them. Moreover, welfare agencies, lacking the staff necessary to process a large number of claims rapidly, caused endless delays in responding to applications for support as they corresponded with other agencies to see if claimants had received benefits previously or tried to shift the burden of supporting them elsewhere. Thus, the Weimar Welfare Administration quickly became an instrument of discrimination and control, as officials made it clear to claimants that they would only receive the minimum due to them, and inquired intrusively into their personal circumstances to ensure that this was the case. None of this endeared the Republic to those whom it was intended to help. Complaints rose, fisticuffs, even demonstrations were far from uncommon inside and outside welfare offices. A sharp insight into the kind of problems which the welfare system was confronting and the way it went about dealing with them is provided by the example of a saddler and upholster, Adolf G. Born in 1892, Adolf had fought in the 1914 to 1918 war and sustained a serious injury, not in a heroic battle against the enemy, however, but from a kick in his stomach by a horse. It required no fewer than 6 intestinal operations in the early 1920s. An old industrial accident and a family with 6 children put him into further categories of welfare entitlement apart from war injury. Unable to find a job after the war, he devoted himself to campaigning for state support instead. But the local authorities in Stuttgart demanded, as a condition of continuing his accident benefits after 1921, that he surrender his radio receiver and aerial, since those were banned from the municipal housing in which he lived. When he refused to do this, he was evicted with his family, a move to which he responded with a vigorous campaign of letter writing to the authorities, including the Labor Ministry of Berlin. He acquired a typewriter to make his letters more legible and tried to acquire other kinds of benefits, reflecting his situation as a war invalid and a father of a large family. The conflict escalated. In 1924, he was imprisoned for a month and a half for assisting in the attempted abortion presumably because he and his wife thought that in the circumstances 6 children were enough. In 1927, he was fined for insulting behavior. In 1930, his benefits were cut and restricted to certain purposes, such as the purchase of clothes, while his housing allowance was paid direct to his landlord. He was charged in 1931 with welfare fraud because he had been trying to make a little money on the side as a rag-and-bone man, and again in 1933 for busking. He approached political organizations of the right and left in order to get help. An attempt to persuade the authorities that he needed 3 times more food than the average man because of his stomach injury that left him unable to digest most of what he ate was rebuffed with stony formality. In 1931, at the end of his tether, he wrote to the Labor Ministry in Berlin, comparing the Stuttgart welfare officials to robber barons of the Middle Ages. What angered the somewhat obsessive Adolf G was not just the poverty in which he and his family were condemned to live, but still more the insults done to his honor and standing even in the lower reaches of German society by a welfare apparatus that seemed determined to question his motives and his entitlements in seeking the support that he felt he deserved. The anonymous, rule-bound welfare bureaucracy insulted his individuality. Such feelings were far from uncommon among welfare claimants, particularly where their claim for support resulted from the sacrifices they had made during the war. The huge gulf between the Weimar Republic's very public promises of a genuinely universal welfare system based on need and entitlement and the harsh reality of petty discrimination, intrusion, and insult to which many claimants were exposed on the part of the welfare agencies did nothing to strengthen the legitimacy of the Constitution in which these promises were enshrined. More ominous by far, however, was the fact that health and welfare agencies, determined to create rational and scientifically informed ways of dealing with social deprivation, defiance, or deviance and crime, with the ultimate aim of eliminating them from German society in generations to come, encouraged new policies that began to eat away at the civil liberties of the poor and the handicapped. As the social welfare administration mushroomed into a huge bureaucracy, so the doctrines of racial hygiene and social biology, already widespread among welfare professionals before the war, began to acquire more influence. The belief that heredity played some part in many kinds of social deviance, including not only mental deficiency and physical disability, but also chronic alcoholism, persistent petty criminality, and even moral idiocy in groups such as prostitutes, many of whom were in fact forced into sex work by economic circumstances, hardened into a dogma. Medical scientists and social administrators began to compile elaborate card indexes of the asocial. As such, deviants were now commonly called Liberal penal reformers argued that, while some inmates in state prisons could be reclaimed for society by the right sort of educational programs, a great many of them were completely incorrigible. Incorrigible or incorrigible? Wait.
Incorrigible.
It's incorrigible. Where were we? Liberal penal reformers argued that, while some inmates in state prisons could be reclaimed for society by the right sort of educational programs, a great many of them were completely incorrigible, largely because of the inherited degeneracy of their character. The police played their part, too, identifying a large number of professional criminals and habitual offenders to place under intensive surveillance. This frequently became a self-fulfilling prophecy, as surveillance and identification left released prisoners no chance of engaging in an honest trade. In Berlin alone, the police fingerprint collection numbered over 500,000 10-finger cards by 1930. The spread of such ideas through the professional worlds of medicine, law enforcement, penal administration, and social work had very real consequences. Psychologists asked to assess the mental health of convicted criminals began to use biological criteria, as in the case of an unemployed vagrant, Florian Huber, convicted of armed robbery and murder in Bavaria in 1922. Huber concluded a psychological assessment of the young man, who had suffered severe injuries in war action, earning him the award of the Iron Cross. Although in other respects he cannot be proven to be hereditarily damaged, demonstrated some physical evidence of degeneracy. The structure of his physiognomy is asymmetrical to the extent that the right eye is situated markedly lower than the left. He has a tendency towards full-throatedness. His earlobes are elongated, and above all, he has been a stutterer since youth. This was taken as evidence, not that he was unfit to stand trial, but that he was incorrigible and should therefore be executed, which indeed he was. Legal officials in many parts of Germany now made liberal use of terms, such as vermin or pest, to describe criminals, denoting a new biological way of conceptualizing the social order as a kind of body, from which harmful parasites and alien microorganisms had to be removed if it was to flourish. In the search for more precise and comprehensive ways of defining and applying such concepts, a medical expert, Theodor Wernstein, founded a Criminal Biological Information Center in Bavaria in 1923 to gather information about all known criminal offenders, their families, and their background, and thereby to identify hereditary chains of deviance. By the end of the decade, Wernstein and his collaborators had collected a vast index of cases and were well on the way to realizing their dream. Soon, similar centers had been founded in Thuringia, Württemberg, and Prussia as well. Many experts thought once such dynasties of inferior human beings had been mapped out, compulsory sterilization was the only way to prevent them reproducing themselves further. In 1920, two such experts, the lawyer Carl Binding and the forensic psychiatrist Alfred Hockey, went one crucial step beyond this and argued in a short book in which they coined the phrase, "a life unworthy of life," that what they called ballast existences, people who were nothing but a burden on the community, should simply be killed. Another scholar, Brittany Simon, referred to them as level ones. Just kidding. The incurably ill and the mentally retarded were costing millions of marks and taking up thousands of much-needed hospital beds, they argued. So doctors should be allowed to put them to death. This was an ominous new development in the debate over what to do with the mentally ill, the handicapped, the criminal, and the deviant. In the Weimar Republic, it still met with impassioned hostility on the part of most medical men. The Republic's fundamental insistence on the rights of the individual prevented even the doctrine of compulsory sterilization from gaining any kind of official approval, and many doctors and welfare officers still doubted the ethical legitimacy or social effectiveness of such a policy. The very considerable influence of the Catholic Church and its welfare agencies was also directly firmly against such policies. As long as economic circumstances made it possible to imagine that the Republic's social aspirations could one day be realized, the continuing debate on compulsory sterilization and involuntary euthanasia remained unresolved. Middle-class Germans reacted to the 1918 Revolution and the Weimar Republic in a wide variety of ways. Perhaps the most detailed account we have of one man's response is from the diaries of Victor Klemperer, whose experience of the inflation we already have noted. Klemperer was in many ways typical of the educated middle-class German who just wanted to get on with his life and relegated politics to a relatively small part of it, though he voted at elections and always took an interest in what was going on in the political world. His career was neither entirely conventional nor outstandingly successful. After making a living as a newspaper writer, Klemperer had turned to the university world, qualifying shortly before the war with the obligatory two theses, the first on German, the second on French literature. As a relative newcomer and outsider, he was obliged to start his academic career in a post at the University of Naples, from where he observed the deterioration of the international situation before 1914 with concern. He supported the German declaration of war in 1914 and considered the German cause a just one. He returned to Germany and joined up, served on the Western Front, and was invalided out in 1916, working in the Army Censorship Office up to the end of the war. Like other middle-class Germans... Wait, hold on. Okay. Like other middle-class Germans, Klemperer saw his hopes for a stable career dashed with the defeat of Germany. For such a man, only a return to orderly and political circumstances could provide the basis for a steady income and a permanent job in a German academic institution. The events of the last 2 months of 1918 were upsetting to him in more than one respect. He wrote in his diary, "The newspaper now brings so much shame, disaster, collapse, things previously considered impossible, that I, filled to bursting with it, just duly accept it, hardly read any more. After all I see and hear, I am of the opinion that the whole of Germany will go to the devil if this soldiers' and workers' uncouncil, this dictatorship of senselessness and ignorance, is not swept out soon. My hopes are pinned on any general of the army that is returning from the field." Working temporarily in Munich, he was alarmed by the antics of the revolutionary government early in 1919. They talk enthusiastically of freedom, and their tyranny gets ever worse, and recorded hours spent in libraries trying to do his academic work while the bullets of the invading Free Corps whizzed past outside. Normality and stability were what Klemperer wanted, yet they were not to be had. In 1920, as we have seen, He managed to obtain a professorship at Dresden Technical University, where he taught French literature, researched and wrote, edited a journal, became increasingly frustrated as he saw younger men obtain senior positions at better institutions. In many ways, he was a typical moderate conservative of his time, patriotic, bourgeois, German through and through, in his cultural attitudes and identity, and a believer in the notion of national character, which he expressed at length in his historical work on 18th century French literature. Yet, in one crucial respect, he was different, for Victor Klemperer was Jewish. The son of a preacher in the extremely liberal Reform synagogue in Berlin, he had been baptized as a Protestant, one of a growing number of German Jews who acculturated in this way. This was more a social than a religious decision, since he does not seem to have had a very strong religious faith of any kind. In 1906, he provided further evidence of his acculturation by marrying a non-Jewish German woman, the pianist Eva Schlemmer, with whom he came to share many intellectual and cultural interests, above all, perhaps, an enthusiasm for the cinema. The couple remained childless, yet through all the vicissitudes of the 1920s, it was his marriage that gave stability to his life, despite the couple's increasingly frequent bouts of ill health, exaggerated perhaps by growing hypochondria. Throughout the 1920s, he lived a stable, if less than completely contented life, disturbed early on by fears of civil war, although this never materialized and looked less likely after 1923. He filled his diary with reports of his work, his holidays, his amusements, his relationships with his family, friends, and colleagues, and other aspects of the daily routine. I often ask myself, he wrote on September 10, 1927, why I write such an extensive diary, a question to which he had no real answer. It was simply a compulsion. I can't leave it alone. Publication was dubious. So what was his purpose? Just collect life, always collect impressions, knowledge, reading, events, everything, and don't ask why or what for. Klemperer occasionally let slip that he felt his career blocked by the fact that he was Jewish. Despite his increasing output for scholarly works on French literature history or literary history, he was stuck in Dresden's Technical University with no prospect of moving to a post in a major university institution. There are reactionary and liberal universities. He noted on December 26, 1926, the reactionaries don't take any Jews. The liberal ones always have 2 Jews already and don't take a third. The growth of anti-Semitism in the Weimar Republic also posed problems for Klemperer's political position. It's gradually becoming clear to me, he wrote in September of 1919, how new and insurmountable a hindrance anti-Semitism means for me. And I volunteered for the war. Now I am sitting, baptized and nationalistic, between all stools. Klemperer was rather unusual among middle-class Jewish professionals in his conservative political views. The increasingly rabid anti-Semitism of the German nationalists, with whose general political line he rather sympathized, made it impossible for him to support them, despite all of his nostalgia for the pre-war days of the Bismarckian and Wilhelmine Reich. Like many Germans, Klemperer found himself apathetic and indifferent when he contemplated the violent party political conflicts of the Weimar Republic. Instinctively hostile to the left, Klemperer was nonetheless obliged to record in March 1920, as he heard the news of the Kapp push in Berlin, "My inclination to the right has suffered greatly as a result of permanent anti-Semitism. I would dearly like to see the current pushists put up against a wall. I truly cannot work up any enthusiasm for the oath-breaking army, and really not at all for the immature and disorderly students. But neither can I for the legal Ebert government either, and less still for the radical left. I find them all off-putting." What an agonizing tragicomedy, he wrote, that 5,000 to 8,000 soldiers can overthrow the whole German Reich. Surprisingly, perhaps, for a man who devoted his working life to the study of French literature, he was very much in favor of waging another war against the French, perhaps as a result of his experiences on the Western Front during the war, still more as a result of his evident outrage at the Treaty of Versailles. But this hardly seemed possible under the Weimar Republic. On April 20th, 1921, he wrote, "The monarchy is my banner. I long for the old German power. I want all the time to strike once again against France. But what kind of disgusting company one keeps with the German racists? It will be even more disgusting if Austria joins us, and everything we now feel was felt with more or less justification by the French after 70, and I would not have become a professor under Wilhelm II, and yet..." Already in 1925, he was regarding the election of Hindenburg as president as a potential disaster, comparable to the assassination of Archduke Franz Ferdinand in 1914. Fascism everywhere. The terrors of the war have been forgotten, and Russian terror was driving Europe into reaction. As time went on, Klemperer grew weary of the constant political excitement. In August of 1932, as the Weimar Republic entered its final turbulent phase, he wrote, "Moreover, I don't need to write the history of my times, and the information I provide is dull. I am half repelled, half full of a fear to which I don't want to surrender myself, completely without enthusiasm for any party. The whole thing is meaningless, undignified, miserable. Nobody plays a part for himself. Everyone's a puppet. Hitler before the gates, or who else? And what will become of me, the Jewish professor?" He preferred instead to write about the small black kitten that had wandered into their house and instantly became their pet. Under the influence not only of the threatening political situation, but also of his wife's serious clinical depression and frequent illnesses, Klemperer wrote less and less and seemed by the end of 1932 on the verge of abandoning his diary altogether. Klemperer's political pessimism owed a lot to the personal troubles he was experiencing, yet his attitude was shared by many patriotic, liberal, conservative German Jews who felt ill at ease amidst the conflicts of the Weimar Republic. Beyond that, his distaste for the extremes of politics and his disquiet at the violence and fanaticism that surrounded him was surely characteristic of many middle-class Germans, whatever their background. His Jewish ethnicity not only caused him to suffer some adverse discrimination, but it also gave him a sharp and sardonic eye for political developments that were ominous for the future, as he rightly guessed. Yet he did not suffer unduly from anti-Semitism. He did not experience any violence. Indeed, he did not record a single instance of a personal insult in his diary at this time. In formal terms, Jews such as Klemperer enjoyed far more freedom and equality under the Weimar Republic than they had ever done before. The Republic opened up new opportunities for Jews in the civil service, politics, and the professions, as well as in government. A Jewish foreign minister like Walther Rathenow would have been unthinkable under the Wilhelm and Reich, for instance. The Jewish-owned parts of the press, particularly the newspapers controlled by the two Jewish liberal firms of Mosse and Olstein, which together produced over half the newspapers sold in Berlin in the 1920s, strongly supported the liberal institutions of the Republic. The arts' newfound freedom from censorship and official disapproval brought many Jewish writers, painters, and musicians to prominence as apostles of modernist culture, where they mingled easily with non-Jewish figures like the composer Paul Hindemith, the poet and playwright Bertolt Brecht, or the artists Max Breckmann and George Grosz. Jews signaled their support for the Republic by voting particularly for the Democrats, and to a lesser extent for the parties on the left, or of the left. On the other hand, partly in reaction to these developments, the 1920s also witnessed a broadening and deepening of the currents of anti-Semitism in German politics and society. Even before the war, the Pan-Germans and others on the right had pumped out propaganda accusing the Jews of undermining the German nation. This kind of racist conspiracy theory was more than shared by military leaders such as Ludendorff. It found notorious expression during the war in the so-called Jewish census of October 1916, ordered by senior army officers who hoped it would give them support in refusing Jews admission to the officer corps once the war was over. The aim was to reveal the cowardly and disloyal nature of the Jews by showing statistically that Jews were underrepresented in the army and that those who had joined up were overrepresented in desk jobs. In fact, it showed the reverse. Many Jewish Germans, like Victor Klemperer, were nationalists to the core and identified strongly with the Reich. German Jews were over, rather than underrepresented in the armed forces and at the front. Confounding the expectations of anti-Semitic officers to such a degree, the results of the census were suppressed. But the knowledge that it had been ordered caused a great deal of anger among German Jews, even if the attitudes it revealed were not shared by the majority of rank-and-file troops. After the war, the widespread belief on the right that the German army had been stabbed in the back by revolutionaries in 1918 translated easily into anti-Semitic demagogy. It was, men like Ludendorff evidently believed, the Jews who had done the stabbing, who led subversive institutions like the Communist Party, who agreed to the Treaty of Versailles, who set up the Weimar Republic, In fact, of course, the German army was defeated militarily in 1918. There was, as we have seen, no stab in the back. Leading politicians who signed the treaty, like Matthias Erzberger, were not Jewish at all. If Jews like Rosa Luxemburg were overrepresented in the Communist Party leadership, or like Eugen Levine in the revolutionary upheavals in Munich early in 1919, they were not acting as Jews but as revolutionaries, alongside many non-Jews, such as Karl Liebknecht, who many right-wingers thought instinctively must be Jewish because of his ultra-left political views. Most Jewish Germans supported the solid liberal parties of the center, or to a lesser extent, the Social Democrats, rather than the revolutionary left, whose violent activism shocked and appalled a respectable citizen like Klemperer. Nevertheless, the events of 1918 to 1919 gave a boost to anti-Semitism on the right, convincing many waverers that racist conspiracy theories about the Jews were correct after all. Alongside extreme right-wing propaganda scapegoating Jews for the catastrophes of 1918 to 1919, there also emerged a more popular form of anti-Semitism, directed particularly at war profiteers and the small number of financiers who managed to get rich quick in the throes of the inflation. Anti-Semitism had always surged at times of economic crisis, and the economic crises of the Weimar Republic dwarfed anything that Germany had witnessed before. A fresh source of conflict arose in the gathering pace of immigration on the part of impoverished Jewish refugees fleeing anti-Semitic violence and civil war in Russia. There were perhaps 80,000 Eastern Jews in Germany before the First World War, and their arrival, along with that of a much larger number of immigrant workers from Poland and elsewhere, had led the Reich government to introduce a virtually unique kind of citizenship law in 1913, allowing only those who could show German ancestry to claim German nationality. After the war, there was a renewed influx as the Bolshevik Revolution swept across Russia, prompting anti-Semitic pogroms and murders on a huge scale by the revolution's Tsarist opponents. Although the immigrants acculturated quickly and were relatively few in number, they nevertheless formed an easy target for popular resentments. At the height of the hyperinflation, on November 6th of 1923, a reporter observed serious disturbances in a district of Berlin with a high proportion of Jewish immigrants from the East. Everywhere, in the side streets, a howling mob. Looting takes place under cover of darkness. A shoe shop at the corner of Dragoon Street is ransacked. The shards of the window panes are lying around on the street. Suddenly, a whistle sounds. In a long human chain covering the entire width of the street, a police cordon advances. "Clear the street," an officer cries. "Go into your houses." The crowd slowly moves on. Everywhere with the same shouts. "Beat the Jews to death." "Fuck Dan Saltman." Just kidding. Demagogues have manipulated the starving people for so long that they fall upon the wretched creatures who pursue a miserable goods trade in the Dragoon Street cellar. It is inflamed racial hatred, not hunger, that is driving them to loot. Young lads immediately follow every passerby with a Jewish appearance in order to fall upon him when the moment is right. Such a public outburst of violence was symptomatic of the new preparedness of anti-Semites. Like so many other groups on the fringes of German politics, to stir up or actively employ violence and terror to gain their ends, rather than remaining content, as they mostly had been before 1914 with mere words. A wave of still imperfectly documented incidents of personal violence against Jews and their property, attacks on synagogues, acts of desecration carried out in Jewish cemeteries was the result. What? Okay. It was not just an unprecedented willingness to translate vehement prejudice into violent action that broadly distinguished post-1918 anti-Semitism from its pre-war counterpart. While the overwhelming majority of Germans still rejected the use of physical force against Jews during the Weimar Republic, the language of anti-Semitism became embedded in mainstream political discourse as never before. The stab in the back, the November traitors, the Jewish Republic, the Jewish Bolshevik conspiracy to undermine Germany, all these and many similar demagogic slogans could be regularly read in the papers, whether as expressions of editorial opinion or in reporting of political incidents, speeches, and trials. They could be heard day after day in legislative assemblies where the rhetoric of the nationalists, the second largest party after the Social Democrats during the middle years of the Republic, was shot through with anti-Semitic phrases. These were more extreme and more frequently employed than they had been by the conservatives before the war, and were amplified by splinter groups of the right that collectively enjoyed much more support than the anti-Semitic parties of Allwart, Bokel, and their ilk. Bokel. I can't pronounce this stupid letter. Closely allied to many of these groups was the German Protestant Church, deeply conservative and nationalist by conviction, and also prone to outbursts of anti-Semitism. But Catholic anti-Semitism also took on new vigor in the 1920s, animated by fear of the challenge of Bolshevism, which had already launched violent attacks on Christianity in Hungary and Russia at the end of the war. There were large swaths of the German electorate on the right and in the center that frequently desired a rebirth of German national pride and glory after 1918. They were, to a greater or lesser degree, convinced as a result that this had to be achieved by overcoming the spirit of Jewish subversion that had supposedly brought Germany to its knees at the end of the war. The sensibility of many Germans was so blunted by this tide of anti-Semitic rhetoric that they failed to recognize that there was anything exceptional about a new political movement that emerged after the end of the war to put anti-Semitism at the very core of its fanatically held beliefs, the Nazi Party. The rise of Nazism. Wow. That's crazy, chat. One thing that the author expresses, I think one of the things that Evans was trying to get across for the beginning was, and it's something that I've repeated a lot, is that history is not inevitable. That it's not like in the year 1900, World War II was like inevitable, that there were a lot of things that could have happened otherwise. One thing that he points out, and he keeps pointing it out, is that like even though there is like a rise of anti-Semitism, or even though there's a rise of like revolutionary violent action or whatever, the majority of Germans still didn't support it. One thing that's kind of like sticking out of my head though is that I think there's a huge difference between like 1% of a population supporting a thing and like 5% of a population supporting a thing. I guess it's almost like a disease if you think about it. Like in the human body, your immune system is either completely eradicating something, basically, or it's not. There is no like 5 to 10 healthy percent of like a disease in your body. Where I guess like the parallel today is that it's not so much that like everybody in some political party believes a thing, but the fact that the ideas are so pervasive and they're not immediately considered distasteful, or they're not immediately considered like unacceptable. Like Elon doing his Nazi salutes. It's probably a huge problem. Can you look at the coffee zone meme before you go? Like taking over Canada and Greenland? True. Why, this is so old, isn't it? I don't, like, people are tweeting about this, but wasn't this document literally leaked like a fucking year ago? Am I crazy? Sam Bankman Fried's plan, if he got caught, LeMayo, go on Tucker Carlson, come out as a Republican. Or was it years ago? I'd never heard of this before. Oh, I feel like I read this like a long, long time ago. Like when you got first arrested or some bullshit. Ironic that Elon was on Rogan a few years ago talking about mind viruses, and now he's helping spread them. True. Yes, but he's now on Tucker Carlson. Oh, funny. Do you really believe that Elon Musk meant to do the salute, or is it a meme? I think it's both. I don't think Elon Musk is like a Nazi, but I think he wants to signal to people that he's like cool and shit, and he's like okay with like ultra far right people, and he can be like a cool dude to him. That's just my take on it, but it was definitely, it was like an intentional Nazi salute twice, for sure. I just think he's doing it for fucking retarded reasons. Wow. I think it was to own the libs and get lib tears. Yeah, maybe. What is this?
Narrative that our house is a mess, that there's dog shit everywhere, that Sonny is eating shit and getting giardia, and that, you know, et cetera, et cetera. And well, it culminated in somebody finally, an anonymous call went into them on the 3rd, saying that they were somebody that works at the house, and they wanted to report us because our kids are crawling around eating dog shit and getting viruses. And they were able to provide enough details because of what I said on the show to make it appear that it was somebody. He said, like, when he first showed up, he's like, it's somebody that you know who made the report. And I'm like, no, okay. So I mean, they used. I mean, yeah, you could easily impersonate.
Oh, sorry.
You're good. Go ahead.
What's truly like despicable to me is the fact that, like, you hear so often that CPS, like, that they're not always.
They're underfunded.
Yes, and also it always like seeps through the cracks for some reason.
Yeah.
And so the fact that they were so on it here, it's like that could have gone to a family that really needed it and a child that really needed to.
Damn. Okay. I love you guys. I'll be back tomorrow. We might brainstorm tomorrow. I think I'm talking to George Santos. Is it Santos or Santos? I don't know. But it's in like 2 weeks. That should be interesting. We'll see how that goes. All right. You guys have fun. Be careful. Rubberino, cappuccino, 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 cappuccino. I'll catch you guys next stream.